Welcome to part 22 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this section, we're shifting our focus to level design using the tile level editor. We'll go over how to create our dungeon layout, add interactive objects, and export the necessary data for our Phaser game. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and start building our game world with Tiled. Now that we've added interactable objects like chests and pots, it's time to start building out the actual world our game takes place in. To design our levels efficiently, we'll be using Tiled, a powerful and flexible level editor. With Tiled, we can visually create our maps, define object placements and set up collision layers, and even store metadata for things like enemy spawn locations and room connections. By the end of the section, we'll have our dungeon fully designed and ready to load into our game. Let's jump in and start creating our levels. To start building our levels in Tiled, we'll need to download the assets we'll be using for our project. In the description of this video, there'll be a link to this page here, as well as a direct download to a zip folder. This zip folder is going to have all of our assets we'll need for Tiled, as well as some utility scripts we'll use for parsing our level data inside our game. If you can download that zip folder now and extract it, you should see the following contents. There should be 4 main folders: Assets, Other, Scripts, and Tiled. Assets, this just has the original asset files that were used for our project. Other has our diagrams that we've referenced in our series. Scripts, this has some utility scripts that will help us in parsing our data from Tiled inside our Phaser game. We'll add these to our project later. And so Tiled, this has all the assets we'll need for our Tiled project, as well as the final dungeon and world maps that we'll build for our project. So now that we have our project files, let's go ahead and open up Tiled. So once we've opened up Tiled, let's do Open File or Project, and now let's choose our Zelda Tiled project file. This will open up our existing project, and now if we do Open File, let's open up our Dungeon 1 and our world levels. For our game, we'll be using Tiled to create and manage the tile maps for each area of our game. As an example, we'll build a dungeon tile map and an overworld tile map to see how different areas come together. Tiled will allow us to not only design the background and foreground images for our levels, but also define the metadata our game needs. This includes placement of objects like our chest, our pots, our buttons, and our doors, positioning and types of enemies, defining rooms or areas within our dungeon and overworld and their sizes, setting up level connections and transitions, collision boundaries for our players and for our enemies, and much more. To manage this metadata efficiently, we'll take advantage of Tiled's built-in tools. We'll create custom object types and place these objects into our tile map and set up layers to handle collision boundaries. By doing this, we can export our level data as a JSON file, which Phaser can then use to dynamically generate our levels. Our JSON file will store level information for collision detection in Phaser's physics system, object layers defining interactive game elements, how we'll build our levels in Tiled. First, we'll define our level layout. We'll start by creating 2 layers, one for our background and one for the foreground. Next, we'll import assets and create our tile sets. These tile sets will allow us to decorate our levels and define the playable environment. Then we'll set up our boundaries and our rooms. We'll outline our collision areas and structure individual rooms for our dungeon. Finally, we'll add our interactive objects. Using object layers, we'll place important game elements like our doors, our chests, and our enemies. By structuring our game this way, we keep our game logic and visuals separate, making it easier to manage. Instead of hard-coding levels in Phaser, we can export images and metadata from Tiled, reducing manual setup inside the game engine. Now that we understand our project structure, let's jump in and start building our levels from scratch. To start building our level, let's do File, we'll do New, let's do a new map. For our new map, we'll leave our default settings for our orientation, our tile layer format, and our tile render order as is. Alright, so for our map size, we'll do 64 by 48 tiles. For our tile size, we'll want to make sure we do 16 pixels by 16 pixels. This should result in a map size of 1024 by 768. Let's hit OK, and this should create our new map. So the first thing we'll do is let's save our new map. So we'll do File, let's do Save As. I'm going to make a new folder. I'm just going to call this Levels. And now for our file name, I'm just going to call this Dungeon_1. To start building our level, first we'll need to import our tile sets we'll be using for our tile layers. To do that, we'll click on New Tile Set. Let's click on Browse. And now under our tiled folder, let's go into Assets. We'll start off with our collision image. Let's do Open. Now for our settings, we just want to leave our type based on tileset image, and we want to do Embed in Map. We can leave our default name that's selected. Then for our tile width and height, we'll just want to make sure this is 16 by 16 with no margin and spacing. Let's hit OK. And what this will do, this is going to add a new tile set to our project that will be able to choose our tile and add that to our layer here. Let's add another tile set to our project. So if we come down here, let's do new, we'll do browse. Let's choose our legend spider dungeon image. We'll hit open. And now for our settings, we can leave the default as is. We'll just want to make sure our tile width and height are set to 16 and we have no margin or spacing. Let's hit OK. And now this will add another tile set and we can toggle between them by clicking our tabs here. And now because we set our frames to be 16 by 16, our image is now split up into these individual frames where we can click on them and then add them to our tile layer. To start building our level, we'll start off by adding a background image to our map that we'll be able to use for reference while building out our dungeon. So in Tiled, we have a variety of different layers that we can use in our map. The most basic of our layers is our tile layer, and now this layer allows us to grab our various tiles and then paint them on to our tile map. Besides our tile layer, we can also create what's called an object layer, and your object layers, this is how we can add our metadata or our objects to our map. And so for the objects we add, this is really just metadata we want to attach to our map, and then we can parse that in our Phaser game. Next, we have a group layer, and so a group layer is just a way for us to organize our layers together. As an example, when we're adding in our rooms, we can create nested structure like this, where all of our layers for our various objects are tied to a single room, and now we have them grouped by rooms here, and this will help keep our project organized. And finally, we have what's called an image layer, and this layer allows us to choose an image to add to our map. This is a great way to add a background to your level, or to add a guide that you want to use as reference while you're designing your level. Now that we've reviewed our various layer types, let's start off by creating an image layer for our project. We'll do a new image layer. We're going to call this guide. So now for our level, we're going to add a background image we'll use for reference while we're building out our dungeon. Alright, so to add an image, if we click on our layer, over on our panel, on the image property, if we click on the choose button here, we can choose an image to add to our project. From our tiled folder, let's do example, and let's do our dungeon 1 background. What this will do is it's going to load in our image, and it should match the size of our level that we've defined for our map. Now, one of the things we can do for our various layers is we can update the opacity on them, so then that way we can see through our various layers. So if we click on our guide layer, let's update our opacity, and we're going to make our layer a little bit transparent, so now we can use it as a reference while we build our dungeon. So while we're working with our layers, a few useful things to note is we can toggle the visibility of our layers while we're working with them by clicking the eye icon. And then we can also lock our layers, so then that way we can't modify them. This will be really nice while we're working with our tile layers, so then that way as we're painting our tiles, we'll make sure we're working on our right layer and we don't paint on the wrong one by mistake. One last thing we can do is we can update the ordering of our layers. This will be important as we're working on our various layers and how we want them to be presented to us in the UI. As an example, if we take our opacity for our guide layer, let's move it all the way up so it's no longer transparent. If we click on our tile layer, if we choose one of our tiles and try to paint it onto our layer, it doesn't look like it's working. What's happening is our guide layer is on top of our tile layer, and since it's not transparent, this is what's visible to us in the UI. And so if we take our guide layer and we move it down below our tile layer, now we'll see all those tiles that I was painting are now visible to us. And so this is something to keep in mind as we're working with our various layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete our tile layer, and then we'll save. Now that we have our guide image in place, we're going to start building our level. So for designing our level, we want to mimic the look and feel of the classic Zelda games. And how this usually works while we're in a dungeon is for a single room of our dungeon, our player will be in it, and our camera for what's visible to our player will be locked to that room. And so as our player moves around our room, our camera is going to be stationary and the player won't be able to see outside the bounds of this box here. Now, as the player navigates our dungeon and transitions between our various rooms, our camera is going to move to our next room and show that view to our player. So what this would look like if our player goes from this room to this room, we're going to take our level and just kind of shift it down, and then that way this room is now visible in our camera. Now we would repeat this pattern for each of our single rooms like this until our player encounters a room that's bigger than that defined area. How this will work is once our player enters this room, this red box represents our whole room, and our camera will be bounded to that room. And so how this will work is our player navigates up, our camera is going to follow our player until we reach the end of our room and our bounding box for our camera. And so while we're designing our level, we'll want to design our rooms in a similar fashion. And so to recreate that feeling, we'll want to make sure the size of our rooms is at least as big as our phaser game configuration. So for our phaser game configuration, right now we're set to 256 by 224 pixels. And so for our rooms, because each of our tiles is 16 pixels, that means our dungeon room needs to be at least 16 by 14. And so as long as we design our rooms to be at least that size, we'll make sure our camera stays within our room bounds. Now we can make our rooms bigger and our camera will just follow our player when we're in that particular room. In the same approach, we'll be able to use this in our open area for our world level, where our room is just one big room where our camera will follow our player. And so one thing to note is by designing our levels this way, and defining our visible areas in our game as these rooms, we'll be able to know what part of our tile map we actually need to paint and what parts we can leave empty. Because once we go to export this out as our image, we're going to have this missing gap like this, but for our dungeon, this will be the only visible area to our player, and we'll control that through our code when we move our camera in our game. Now that we have reviewed how we'll design our levels, we'll start building out our first map. For our map, we need to start off by creating two new layers, one for our background and one for our foreground. How these will work is each of our layers, we're going to export them out as images and then load those into our phaser game. For our background, this is going to be our overall background for our game that will display to our player. For our dungeon, that's going to be our main dungeon layout like this, and we'll use the metadata in our tiled export to populate our other game objects. Our second layer is going to be our foreground, and this is going to be an image that we're going to render on top of our other game objects in our game. By doing this, it's going to allow us to have a dynamic effect where our player can move across our map, and it's going to be on a different layer than our background and our foreground. By doing this, as our player navigates through our dungeon and we want to transition between our rooms, we're going to have this really nice effect where it's going to look like our player is actually moving under our roof of our dungeon here. And so in tiled, what that will look like is we're going to have this background layer here, and this is where we're going to paint our actual map itself with our tile set. And then we'll do the same thing for our foreground, and now we'll be able to quickly choose which layer we want to export and create our image from. So to do this, let's add a new tile layer to our project. We're going to call this background. Let's add in one more tile layer, and we're going to call this foreground. To start designing our levels, we'll begin by creating the background layer, which serves as the foundation for our environment. We'll use a reference image as a guide, ensuring that our layout aligns with our intended level design. As we build out our first level and connect everything together, this structured approach will make it easier to get started. Once you've gone through this process, you can use the same techniques to create your own custom levels with unique layouts and designs. To start painting tiles onto our tile layer, first we need to choose our background layer from the Layers panel. Next, we need to choose a tile that we want to paint onto our map. We'll want to make sure that the stamp brush is selected, and then all you have to do is you just need to click, and you can drag and place your tiles where you like on your map. You can also just click and do one tile at a time, and then if you need to create a straight row, if you hold the Shift key and then click and drag, you can now create a straight row of your tiles. Another useful tool is you can select more than one tile at a time, and so if you select a group of tiles, you can then paint that whole group onto your tile layer. So now for our rooms, I'm going to grab these two tiles here. If we hold the Shift key and click here, we can then click and drag across to create our first wall. Next we'll need to do our sides, so let's grab these two tiles. We'll start here, we'll repeat that process. Let's do our other side. Now we want to do our bottom row, so let's grab those tiles. And now we'll want to do our corners. So for our corners, we can just grab these four tiles here, and then we can snap those into place. Now for our first room, we just need to do our door. So in our tile set, if we scroll down, we can find our open door. Let's grab those tiles, and we'll paint those there. Alright, so now that we have our first room painted, let's go down to our next room, and we'll repeat that process. So just to speed things up a little bit, I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to paint some of our doors and our other tiles when we have those selected. So I'm going to start with our door here. Next, we'll grab our other door. And so while you're painting, if you make any mistakes, you can choose the eraser tool, and then you can erase the tiles that you added. You can also use your shortcut to do the undo. And then finally, since this is like a paint canvas, you can also just paint over your tiles. So as an example, if I have these tiles here, I can then grab these and just draw over it, and now those tiles will take that place. Alright, so I'm going to finish adding in our doors. Next, we'll come back to the top of our tile set, and we'll add in the rest of our walls. So I'm going to grab these tiles here, we'll shift and click, then we can create most of our walls. It's now we just need to repeat the process for the rest of our walls in our dungeon. Alright, for the next part of this video, I'm going to speed this up a little bit, but feel free to pause the video and take your time painting your walls. Alright, for our rooms, where our walls come into our room a little bit, and we have this pointed design like this, we can use this part of our tile set. So if we grab these corner tiles, we should be able to paint those on, and it should match the design of our wall. We'll do the same thing for the other part of our room, so we'll grab those 4 tiles, and we'll paint those on. And now we'll just need to do that to our other dungeon room. So down here, we'll grab our 4 tiles, we'll paint those on. So now for our dungeon entrance, let's grab these 4 tiles here, we'll paint our 1 pillar, we'll grab these 4 tiles, we'll do our other pillar. Now we'll grab this tile here, and that's going to be this part of our room. And now we just need to do our rug. So if we grab this tile, we'll paint those on. Now if we grab the corner part of our rug, we'll paint that on. We'll do our other corner. Let's do this part here, and now we have our entrance. Alright, so now for our dungeon, we'll want to paint this floor piece here, which is an indicator that we're on our way to our boss. So for our dungeon, we'll have our boss located in this room here. This will be a small challenge area before our player gets to our boss, and then our boss key will be needed to unlock this door. So if we grab these tiles here, we can paint that in front of our door. Next for our dungeon, we'll work on adding in our remaining tiles for our floor. So for these tiles here, these represent areas where we'll place a pot in our dungeon. For that, we'll use this tile here, so let's paint those onto our dungeon now. And then for our last room, and now we just need to paint our dungeon floor. For our floor, primarily this will be made up of 1 tile, but then we'll have a few unique tiles scattered throughout our floor just to add some variance to our dungeon's floor. Instead of painstakingly creating these tiles 1 by 1, we'll use tiles random mode to add some random tiles after we paint our initial floor. So now to paint our floor, let's choose this tile here, and instead of painting our tiles 1 by 1, we're going to use our shape fill tool. What that tool allows us to do is we can drag a rectangle onto our tile layer, and it's going to fill up that rectangle with that tile we selected. So what we can quickly do is fill in our main areas for our floor, then we can switch back to our stamp brush and we'll fill in our missing areas. So now to add some randomness to our floor, let's choose all of our tiles for our floor here. Now if we click this dice block here, which enables our random mode, we'll see as we move our cursor around tile, we'll randomly select one of our tiles from that pool, and we can use that to paint some random tiles onto our floor. So now I'm just going to move our mouse around and click in a few random spots just to add some variety to our floor. And so if you keep clicking, you can repaint over your existing tile, and then you can get a random tile in that location. Alright, so now we just need to repeat this pattern for the rest of our rooms. I'm going to speed up this part of this video, but feel free to pause the video and take your time painting your floors. Finally, for our background layer, we just need to add in the top of our dungeon. For this, let's choose this group of tiles here. We'll want to make sure we enable our random mode. And then we're going to use our shape fill tool, and by enabling both our random and our shape fill tool, we can drag our rectangle, and what this will do is it's randomly going to choose one of the tiles that we had selected from our pool. So now we can use our shape fill tool to fill in the rest of our dungeon. Alright, our background layer should now be complete, so now we can move on to our foreground layer. Our foreground layer is primarily just going to be our connections between our rooms and our dungeons So the area our player is going to walk under as they go between our rooms and our entrance into our dungeon. So to create our foreground layer, we're going to copy our tiles from our background layer and paste those onto our foreground layer. Alright, so to copy our tiles, choose our background layer. We want to choose our rectangle select tool. Then we'll drag a rectangle from the top of one of our doors down to the top of our next door. Now we'll have this group of tiles. So we come to our menu, let's do edit, we're going to do copy, or you can use your shortcuts. Now we'll want to choose our foreground layer, and we'll want to do edit, and we'll want to do paste in place. So now to make sure everything worked properly, if we take our background layer, if we make it not visible, we'll see now on our foreground layer, we now have those tiles that we just copied and pasted. Oh, it looks like I grabbed a few extra tiles, so I'm going to erase these tiles from our bottom row here. And so to make it a little bit easier to see what we're doing, I'm going to update our opacity on our background layer, and I'll make it pretty transparent. So now we'll want to repeat this process for other transitions. So let's come down to our room down here. We'll grab our select tool, grab those tiles, I'm going to copy, choose our foreground layer, we'll do paste in place. And so now let's do this for all of our other hallways. So I'm going to copy this here. Then we'll do our door entrance. Alright, so if we hide our background and our guide layers, we should now see our foreground layer with all of our tiles. So now for our foreground layer, we just need to make a few adjustments. First, for our dungeon entrance, we want to remove this yellow from our entrance here. Otherwise, when our player goes to move and leave our dungeon, that floor will show on top of our player, and we only want to have this top part of our archway covering our player. So we'll want to choose this tile here, and then let's paint over those two tiles. Next, we'll want to do the same thing for our doors, and so we want to remove the black piece from our door entryways. So in our tile set, if we come down, we'll see we have the top part of our doors with the black removed. We'll want to grab those two tiles and then paint over those tiles. Alright, let's go ahead and save. I'm going to compare this with our original level. Oh, I just need to fix our side here. We should have one more row on our tiles. To fix that, I'm going to re-enable our background layer. I'm going to grab our select tool. I'm going to copy these tiles here. We'll paste them onto our foreground. Alright, that last change, let's save our level. And now I'm going to lock our background and our foreground layers so we don't actually make changes. Now that we've finished designing our level, we're going to work on setting up our boundaries and defining the area that our player and our enemies can move within our dungeon. To do this, we'll create two new tile layers, one for our player and one for our enemy. And on these tile layers, we're going to paint our boundary of where our player or our enemy will be able to move. So as an example on this tile layer here, we're using a single tile to define all of the areas that our player can move within this level. For our enemies, we do a similar approach, but we block off the entrance into our room to keep our enemies within that room. And so how this will work, when we export out our JSON data for our map, we'll be able to reference this particular layer and then use that to do our collision detections in Phaser. To do this, let's add two new tile layers to our project. For our first one, we're going to call this collision. We'll add in one more tile layer, and we're going to call this enemy collision. We'll start with our enemy collision layer. Let's make sure we select our enemy collision layer from our inspector. Let's choose our collision tile set, and then choose our red tile from that tile set. Now for each of our rooms, we want to paint our tile set where our wall meets our floor. And how this works is when we load our tile layer into Phaser, we'll be able to create an invisible wall and have our enemy game objects collide with this red barrier that we're defining here. This will make it look like with our physics that our enemies are running into our wall, they'll stop, and then move somewhere else. And so like with our Wisp enemy, our enemy will collide with our wall here and then start bouncing around inside our room. And so now we just need to repeat this pattern for the rest of our rooms. And so primarily, where we have this tile where our wall meets our floor, that's where we want to paint this. Alright, so once we're done, our tile layer should look like this. Let's lock that layer, and I'm going to make that layer invisible, and now let's do our player collision layer. So now for our player collision layer, we'll want to do the same thing we did for our enemy collision layer, except when it comes to our entrances to our rooms, We'll want to leave that open so our player can navigate through our various rooms in our dungeon. We'll want to make sure we have an invisible wall here to keep our player constrained to this hallway. To do this, let's choose our collision layer. We'll choose our collision tile from our collision tile set, and then we'll paint the walls in our dungeon. We'll come up to our door, and now for our door, we just want to do a line down to our next door, like this. So now we just need to repeat this pattern for the rest of our dungeon. And so we'll come back to our entrance layer in a second. We'll do the rest of our dungeon. So now for our dungeon entrance, we just want to come over one tile and come all the way down, and then we'll prevent our player from leaving our map. So now when we're done, our player collision tile layer should look like this. So now let's lock our layer and we'll make it not visible. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.